Welcome again, everybody, to the first film thinking event of the 2021 to 22 academic year. We have just watched Charles Burnett's 1990 film To Sleep with Anger, and this second part of the evening is the conversation, for which we are joined by Rolland Murray to my right, Professor of English at Brown, and Rolland is the curator, what we call the curator of today's film event. There is always somebody whom we ask to choose the film that we are going to watch. Rolland selected To Sleep with Anger. To his right is Stéphanie Larrieux, who from the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, here at Brown. And to her right is Matthew Guterl from the Department of American Studies. So welcome to you all. Thanks very much for being part of this event. And we always start with the same question, which is usually posed to the curator of the film. So I would like to begin the conversation by asking Rolland, who selected the film, and selected this film. I think really, it's a really interesting choice. I mean, I just really enjoyed the film that we just watched, but it's an interesting choice. Burnett's body of work. It's not the immediate film that is sort of subjected to academic attention among his work. There are various other films that one could also think about. So maybe, Rolland, you could say something just initially about what makes this film so interesting to you, what makes it significant in relationship to other films that we might have looked at, and so maybe what are your thoughts about this movie?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tim. Thank you for the invitation to curate for this event, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I think, I've had a sort of long-standing fascination with this particular film, and some of the reasons for that are very personal and some of them intellectual. So I thought I could just start by sort of laying out both sides of that here. When I first saw this film in the early 90s, it was really a kind of revelation to me, partly because it resonated so powerfully with my own family's experience. I'm a Californian, and my parents both migrated from the Deep South and settled in California. And so I think it was the sort of like the first time that I'd seen in a sort of cinematic experience a portrait of a family like mine that had left the South and had resettled in the South, and the sort of the feeling throughout the film of like sort of a displaced Southern culture, right? To be in California, not in the South, but yet all of your sensibilities and values are sort of shaped by Southern experience and Southern history. So that very much sort of resonated with me as a person who was the sort of person who was born after the migrants and is having to sort of interpret their sort of Southernness while not being a Southerner. So the film sort of very much resonated quite powerfully with me. And again, on a sort of personal front, it was a film that I shared with my parents a great appreciation for. They really sort of saw themselves in this generation of people that are represented in the film, right? So it was a kind of familial connection that I have to the film. Now this, I think that it's, on a different register, the fact that this film is sort of concerned with migration has resonated with me more deeply over the years, right? And it strikes me that this family in the film is part of that sort of late 20th century migration out of the Deep South to the West, and it is a part of the migration experience that I don't think has garnered a great deal of attention. Certainly not in cinema, and definitely not even really in literature, right? So it's been a sort of a kind of neglected sphere of migration experience especially in comparison to the amount of attention that's granted to the Great Migration in the early part of the 20th century, right? So that the fact that this is such a rarity to get this kind of sensitive treatment of that migration experience made me think, that it would be sort of fruitful to sort of consider sort of like what it is about this particular representation of migration experience that resonates with the sort of broader tradition of representations of Black migration in the 20th century. And so one of the things that sort of stood out to me as I was thinking about that was the sort of deep ambivalence about the relationship to the Southern past that's staged in the film. To be sure, Harry is the chief figure for this ambivalence, right? On one level, right, he's linked to a kind of culture of nostalgia and sentimentality around the Southern past, right? When we first see Harry in the film, he and Susie are sort of waxing poetic about the loss of Southern mores and cultural values, right? Or that great scene where he says, you had to know how to act, right? You had to know your place. So that certainly foregrounds this sort of issue of the nostalgia for Southernness, right? I think that this kind of preoccupation with nostalgia is also sort of deeply embedded in the sort of formal attributes of the film too. And one of the distinctive features that stood out to me was the focus on portraiture in the film. When we first see Harry in the film, right, when he's first alone in the house, he's going through all the family portraits, fingering the portraits on the mantle, and so forth, right? I think it's not accidental, right, that song about memory is sort of resonating as he's sort of doing that, right? The portrait is sort of deeply tied to the sort of nostalgia of the film and the sort of the longing to sort of like connect to a Southern past in that sense, right? And that sort of compositional preoccupation with portraiture sort of is very much present in the film as well, right? From the very beginning, the image of Gideon on fire itself kind of comes across as a kind of portrait of his sort of condition, right? So both aesthetically and with respect to this concept of sort of nostalgia running through the film, portraiture seems to be a sort of key formal attribute of the film, right? And now, of course, the sort of Harry is not only a figure for the sort of nostalgic aspects of the Southern past and Southern culture, but also a figure for its sort of darker history, right? And one of the sort of, I think, pivotal scenes sort of expressing the sort of darkness of his connection to the Southern past is when he takes Gideon for that walk, right? And the sort of ghostly figure of of a past of labor, right? Particularly as railway workers comes up. And it's interesting that the sort of recovery of that history, right, is tied intimately to Gideon's initial illness, right? So the moment of sort of like coming into contact with that history of labor ends up being sort of crucial to his sort of undoing, right? Just underscoring that sort of that sort of darkness that's often attributed to his connection to the Southern past, right? So it might be something worth sort of exploring, right, in conversation further here, the sort of the deep forms of ambivalence that surface around the Southern past, around Southern culture here, right? Just another sort of framework that I was thinking about with this film that might be useful for our conversation here might be to think about it as a film of the 90s, right? Because, right, the late 80s and early 90s were a critical point in the sort of consolidation of a kind of discourse of urban crisis for Black Americans, right? And I'm thinking, particularly on the scholarly side of things like William Julius Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged. But there are a host of other sort of sociological texts produced during this period that are about the various forms of decline that are affecting Black urban life during this period. Jewel Taylor Gibbs's edited collection, Young, Black, and Male in America, an Endangered Species, as another sort of like text from this sort of era, right? And these texts are sort of like recounting a kind of litany of urban ills and unemployment, the rise of the drug trade, the rise of gang violence, right? All the sort of creating almost a sort of national panic about the state of Black urban life, right? And it's sort of running throughout the culture, this kind of sense of impending calamity, right? And one of the other sort of expressions of this sort of panic is like the film industry itself and the representations of Black urban life that we get in that same era, right? So I was thinking of like Colors in '88, which is about gang violence, right, and the policing of gang violence, which comes out in 1988 and really sort of initiates the sort of discourse about urban crisis in the film industry. In later, Boys in the Hood, right, films like Juice, Menace to Society, they're all sort of in this era and tracking out similar sort of anxieties about urban decline and so forth, right? So I think it's fascinating, right, that that Los Angeles is so central to that sort of discourse of urban crisis, right, in this period. Both Colors and Boys in the Hood are set in Los Angeles, for instance, right, as is Menace to Society, right, later. And you can even turn to something like the sort of simultaneous emergence of gangster rap in this period. NWA's early albums come out in the late 80s, early 90s. Again, all of this sort of creating this sort of broad milieu of urban crisis around Black men, much of it not Black men, surfacing around sort of Black life and the sort of panic about it, right, and about its sort of declining condition, right? So I was thinking that it's sort of useful to think about this film as a kind of alternative economy of Black urban life, particularly in Los Angeles, right? And it's for me, the sort of techniques of the film very much seem designed to sort of provide a counterpoint to that discourse, right? And even the way that the final scene of the film wraps things up, right, with Susie's claim, right, that I don't want to hear any more stories about Black people in hell, right? I couldn't help but sort of hear like a very kind of sly repudiation of this sort of preoccupation with violence, spectacular forms of violence that's running throughout this sort of dwelling on urban crisis, right? And there's some other sort of like formal features to this film that I would suggest are sort of bound up with its sort of counterpoint to urban crisis. And one would be the sort of intimacy of the film, right? And one of the sort of chief expressions of that intimacy that I was noting was the sort of all of the focus on touch, right? People are constantly touching each other in this movie, right? Even Harry, right? Every scene he's got his hand on somebody's shoulder, on their arm, right? And so the film sort of has this sort of rich sort of focus on bodily gestures that demonstrate intimacy, hugging, kissing. People are constantly touching each other in this film. And it seems to me this is a sort of like a powerful counterpoint to the general casting of urban life as sort of fragmented and alienated, right? So I think that the sort of focus on touch might be read sort of within that context, right? similarly, the kind of like spatial economy of the film might be sort of another place to go in thinking about this, right? Everything is within a kind of space of sort of domestic intimacy. You're constantly in a living room, a bedroom, right? A drawing room, right? So it's a film that's structurally sort of composed around the creation of different kinds of intimacy, right? So that might be another sort of way to go in sort of opening up some of the sort of the relationship between the sort of the style of the film, the composition of the film, and the broader sort of discourse about Black urban life that's circulating in this era. And then lastly, I guess I would sort of say that another possibility for us to discuss would be just the preoccupation with sort of with Black masculinity in the film, which is so much at the center of Bay Brothers' sort of journey in the film, right? And also given the fact that the whole discourse of like urban crisis often sort of turned on the particular way that Black men were being affected by that. So this film is an interesting sort of management of that kind of conception of crisis, right? So those are just some thoughts that I had about what keeps me coming back to this film, and perhaps some points of further discussion.
Yeah, lovely points, Rolland. So maybe we could revisit a couple of these. There's the question of the South. I mean, back home is how it's constantly referred to, which is so fascinating. So yes, we should talk about that. I'd love also to talk about this what you were calling the deep ambivalence of the film's relationship to Harry in particular. I mean, Harry's the person where that ambivalence just crystallizes and is focused. Even his touch, the touch, right? It's both menacing and also affective in some way. There's something really kind of troubling and disturbing about Harry. I read an interview with Burnett where he said that Harry is a type of person who is seen as evil but isn't evil, which I think seems completely right about the way that the film treats him. So I wonder if we could sort of maybe begin the conversation with the problem of Harry. Why does Harry have to die? I mean, he's already decided to leave the house, and yet he is killed in this slapstick kind of way. I mean, so what? Yeah, and the other kind of side of this, which I think you also alluded to, Rolland, which I find kind of an amazing moment in the film, where Gideon, having recovered essentially with Harry's death, descends the stairs and starts telling this incredible, like ludicrous story of a man who it's a parable, a man who goes to both heaven and hell, and Susie won't let him finish. Gideon. I'm really not going to hear this story right now. And the punchline is missed. And there are so many stories in this film that are begun, and then we never hear they're never explained. This very mysterious moment halfway through the film in the fish fry where Marsh is saying to him, what happened to those guys? And we never hear what happened to those guys. We hear that there's been a killing which was dressed up as a lynching, but none of this is explained. So there are so many like unfinished stories, and then this figure of the unfinished figure of Harry, like what we're supposed to do with him. So, but I mean, Rolland,
you just described my childhood growing up around Southerners. There's always some mysterious, unexplained event that never fully gets articulated.
True.
And shrouded in mystery. But
wrapped in an enigma. Yeah, what to do about Harry? Well, we briefly were talking about watching this another time. My first time watching it, I was deeply unsettled through the film, and we were just actually mentioning a moment ago how to place this in terms of genre. Is this a horror film? Is this a comedy? Is it a documentary? It's a little bit of all of those things. And it's sort of, you kind of drift along a bit and are, with each scene, get deeper and deeper into the greater intimacy. And one of the things I'd like to offer here is to kind of thinking about the film's composition, some of those formal techniques that really achieve this moment for us of like, what to do with Harry? So what I see Burnett doing with the camera, particularly in terms of framing, I mean, almost every shot has a lot in it. A lot of people, a lot in the background. The repeated themes of birds in many different forms, whether they're live chickens in the back, or fried chicken at the end, or pigeons, figurines. There's just a lot of bird imagery, or the dead hawk or owl when they're out in the woods. A number of different things, but particularly what I was drawn to was just how much Burnett's able to fit into a frame, and how so much of that also just creates a greater intimacy. And also his choice to kind of guide you from shot to shot. So the use of color, very vivid. There was like a series of sequences where red is really quite prominent, and sort of adding to that. I'm not sure what to make of this figure here, this hairy person. I'm thinking specifically of the scene where Susie goes up to bed, and then Harry's just hanging out in the shadows. A car comes, and then it turns to a red light, and then at the same time, and then we cut to the kettle, the red kettle, and then cut to Gideon's red pajamas. And I was like, okay, I think I need to note this. I'm not sure exactly what to do with all of it. But there's something happening there, something very intentional. And also just think about the opening images of Gideon on fire, and just kind of several repeated motifs visually throughout the film, like whether it's marbles, birds, different colors, all kinds of things that really are intentional, are meant to do some kind of work that I think is also worth unpacking here. But I was just it really struck me how it really creates that greater intimacy and kind of draws you in both into the horror on some of these things, or the things that are unsettling, or things that just leave you sort of with questions, not unlike all the children that you see here, like Sonny, who's just observing and just probably making notes of things, but like doesn't really, not really sure what he's really thinking. He's just part of the experience here. So I found that to be particularly compelling as well. And then the last thing that I think we'd be remiss not to talk about the use of sound and music in the film. So whether it's blues or gospel, kind of thinking about those as African American musical traditions, also distinctly American in a very particular way, but also how this whole story is a very American story in a very particular way. So I thought that was really, really, really fascinating, and that the motif of the little boy the next door blowing his horn, and Harry's, he's one of those people who's just like, wow, you really know what buttons to press, but yet, as sort of troubling as he is, he's also unifying. He kind of pushes people to think a little bit or re-examine what their beliefs are. So in that moment where I believe he's talking to Susie, it's like, yes, if that child were a friend, he would stop irritating people. But if he stops practicing, he will not get to be sort of the virtuoso that he someday will be. And it's like, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. And there's a number of instances where Harry does that for certainly everyone who's in this environment, but for us too. It's like, you have a point. Probably not the most socially acceptable way to present that, but you do have a point. So that what you were talking about, whether is he someone to how to feel about him. Like he's a provocateur ultimately, and I think that serves very well. And the last thing I want to say about sound and music, at the very final scenes and moving into the end credits, that little boy's still blowing on his horn, and it's still kind of irritating, except at some point it actually smooths out, and you do get the virtuoso performance at the very end. And it's like, oh, that's really quite something, to kind of bring back the sort of resolve the tensions that Harry introduces as a character, and all the all the work that his presence actually does, which is to return to tradition, to bring the family back together. They do sort themselves out, and then we get a smooth sound at the very end.
Actually, I love the points you're making about the film, in a sense, declining the horror genre, because you could, you in a certain another kind of film, Harry would turn into a psychopathic, murderer, right? I mean, one can sort of feel the film almost going in that direction, and it doesn't. He's totally neutralized, and it's such an interesting decision that the film makes on that regard. Also the point about the bad horn playing being a unifying soundscape to the film is beautifully observed. So yeah. Matt, do you want to add anything?
I first of all, I can't thank Rolland enough for bringing us together to watch this movie, because this was really a wonderful movie to sit with and think with, and I'm already quite jazzed about the conversation. I could totally tell the story of this as a horror film. I mean, I think you could. I'm thinking in particular of the moment, that critical moment where Junior and Baby Brother are fighting in the kitchen over the knife, and where Harry's ascendance is nigh, right? So his influence has completely decimated the family and gutted it. And it's a trio of black women descending from the bedroom who rescue the family from that moment. It's such an ambivalent film. It could be read against itself in any number of ways. It starts with Gideon basically daydreaming after reading the Bible of his own bursting into flames in hell, obsessed because he's lost his Toby, his relic that keeps him safe. And the rest of the film seems to move forward from there. He's constantly invoking it as proof of his bad luck. Things happen and we don't see how they happen. I must have watched the broom knock the kettle off the fridge a dozen times on my computer at home, trying to figure out how that happened. And all sorts of things happen, and you never see the actors doing any of them in the film. They just, like, marbles fall on the floor, tea kettles fall. It leaves it completely in your mind as to what actually is happening and whether Harry actually is evil. Mm-hmm. Even that last scene when Susie holds up her hand and says, "I don't want to hear that story. I don't want to hear about black people in hell. I've lived through that." It's unclear to me whether she means that for real or not. Does she feel like they've lived through literal hell, that the devil walked among them for that time? The way this is, to come back to what Colin said before, the nostalgia for the South is also a fear of the South in a way. And in that sense, this movie reminds me a lot of the filmic version of Devil in a Blue Dress, which is also about the black exodus to LA, and roughly the same moment of time. And only there, the fearful South comes when Denzel Washington phones for Mouse to come up from the South. And Mouse brings with him, cataclysmic violence and rescue in the end. But they both have both of those movies, and this one in particular, have a real, almost unreadable or impossible to define ambivalence about what the South actually is: good, bad, evil, supernatural, whatever. It makes it a great movie to talk about.